Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a Wolfram language design review, part of our language completeness and consistency series. And let's see what topics we have here.
This is the third in sort of our sequence of reviewing existing projects. And so, the already covered sections are the things we covered the previous 2 weeks. And so the first two are things we haven't yet discussed.
Okay. 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 So the Grid Summit. So that's a story of trying to align all the options that we have for, grid versus data set formatting versus whatever else. I think we all kind of know what that is. Um, you know, and also, grid potentially, all of these crazy things here, we potentially also want an association syntax for these things.
Well, you've already consented in principle, to the use of cyclic, I think was what we called it, and that will
Yeah,
already make a significant difference.
it will. But it's still, I think it's still useful to be able to say, row headers and things like that. I mean, for example, with grid, what I do all the time is I have a special line at the top or a special line at the left, and I'm doing an append and I'm reformatting that line and so on. That's kind of messy. With Tabular, the notion of headers is separate. And, as it was with old-fashioned table form. And I think what we need to do is take a look at table form, grid, data set, tabular, and try and, you know, sort of merge the designs so that for example, if I want to make a grid and I want to make, it's just a table of numbers or something, and I want headers on those columns, I want a nice clean way to do that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have that for both dataset and tabular, and even we had it for table form. So it's just a question of seeing how to do that. And I think we have some freedom here with some association syntaxes and things like this. I also would like to know how table view relates to this. And I think we've just got too many tabular things, and we need to bring, some consistency to them. I mean, right now, one uses one uses a data set to make if one has tabular data, it's a nice way to get sort of an interactive visualization of that data. If one is trying to make a sort of publication quality, well, I use grid sometimes for that too. And but if one's trying to make sort of a publication quality thing, grid has much more control. I also think that grid themes are an interesting possibility. And along with dataset themes, themes for tabular, which we don't have, right? We didn't put that in, did we?
No.
Okay. So I mean that's another piece. Okay. In any case, so I mean I think that's what we're looking for the Grid Summit. Does that make sense to people?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'll just offer the thought that, table form could have headers because it does so much less than grid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. But I think that the issue with grid is that if there is a cheap syntax for common things you do, that's a win, right? It doesn't
Well,
mean that
and,
we.
and it's also the case that once you wrap up something in a grid, it's not so easy to, program. I mean, if you want to programmatically modify it, you have to kind of extract and modify, and
I'm not so concerned about that.
yeah.
I mean, to me, grid is a presentation tool.
Well, it's a
Like
But that's sort of the header problem, right? I have a thing, I want to wrap headers around it. How
sure,
do I do
right.
that? It's if you want to incorporate it into the existing grid framework,
I see.
it,
I
it's
see. So
it's
you're
it's a
suggesting that maybe we want a symbolic wrapper that is basically a header putting on wrapper. where you take the,
Possibly, yeah.
that might not be a bad idea.
I'm not wed to that idea, but I think it's something we should think about.
Okay, so let's talk about the analogy for a second, okay? You know, you're pushing for labeled to be the future of plot label,
Yeah.
right? Basically,
Yeah.
which is again a wrapper, and I like it very much. You know, I'm very happy using labeled around a plot rather than, you know, using the plot label option. I'm very happy using framed instead of using the frame option. I mean, I use the frame option, but I'm also perfectly happy using framed.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it's an interesting idea. Okay, so this relates to the concept of wrappers that can see enough about what's inside to be able to line themselves up and all that kind of thing. So plot grid is another example of this story where we want to be able to take, you know, multiple plots and be able to sort of put them in a grid and line up their axes and so on, right?
Yeah. To actually reach in to change some of the guts as
Right.
necessary. Yeah.
Right. And so the same thing, I can imagine the same thing working for grid headers. That, you know, I think that will be very convenient actually. You know, I've got this grid, now I want to wrap headers around it, just like I've got this thing and I want to put a label on it. You
Yeah.
know, I think that's a very, I mean, honestly, that's an idea, this whole idea about sort of functionally operating from the outside. I've got a symbolic object, now I want to operate on it. That works very beautifully for us. And
Yeah.
there's a great tendency for people to say, oh, but no, I want to have something from the inside that reaches out. And that's actually a worse idea. So, yeah, so that's an interesting. I hadn't really thought of that before. The possibility of having a headers wrapper, which could even somehow, and with Tabular, we have these notions. I mean, that could work also with Tabular potentially. I mean, in you know, and the interconversion from a tabular to a grid could involve, you know, taking the tabular metadata and putting that in the, you know, in the, I don't know, headered, we could call it, just as that's a bad name, but it's kind of the analog of labeled, right? And the analog of framed,
Yeah.
headed, I don't know. Um, um, okay, but I mean, this general thing about things on the outside being able to reach in enough that they can line themselves up and they can sort of, you know, like line up axes and things. That's an important thing where we're going to need to expose enough metadata. I mean, it has a certain biological character. This thing has to expose things on its cell surface, so to speak. If we were dealing with actual notebook cells, it would literally be on the cell surface. Anyway, never mind. Forget that conceptual pun. Okay, anything more to say about the grid summit? Seems like an important thing to me. And by the way, that should be in the global project list. Grid modernization. Make sense?
I think some pieces of it are, but we can check.
Okay. Grid presentation modernization, which relates to, you know, again, it's going to have many things in common with plot grid. I mean, think about, wouldn't it be nice if plot grid could let you put on headers and things like that as well? I mean, we haven't really had that thought in, you know, graphics grid, for example. You put individual labels, but if you wanted to label a whole column on a graphics grid, it'd be a mess.
Yeah.
And that would be a nice thing to have. Sander is commenting that he likes labeled and style, but not so much legended. Yeah, I don't use legended that much. Why is legended less successful? I mean, can we comment on that? So let me just
I think
let's just
legended
remind
is successful in an invisible way.
Okay, but let's just, how do I do this? If I say legended, I can't do what I'm about to do, right? What does this even do? How does this work? Oh, that doesn't even
Put
work.
something as the second argument. You know, right. So that's just going to be a list of, you know, I mean, that doesn't have any style information.
So what
But
should I be doing here?
Do say line legend of
don't understand.
116, comma, that list.
Wait. You're saying that what this should be is if I said here labeled, and this is another important use of
I'm
these
saying
things.
if you did legended of sign of X, comma, A.
I understand. So, but this will now work labeling that with an A. Beautiful. And so now if I say legended here with B, that's actually pretty nice.
You know, I wonder if part of the issue is that legended isn't a totally local thing in the same sense that
Yes.
labeled and style are. You know, it's basically it's like seeding some list of things to go into a legend, and therefore, you know, these things have to kind of collaborate with one another in some way.
Well, it's one of these things that melts multiple things together, which is
Yes, but when you're looking at the code, it's not melted. As the reader of the code, it's not melted at all.
yeah. Well, I mean, so
And-
this is now,
Well, I
wait a
would-
minute. Doesn't that do it with automatic? Doesn't I thought it labeled it with the actual names. What the hell is that?
No,
That's a bug.
you're thinking of plot, sine, cosine, and plot legends goes to expression.
Why isn't this equivalent? By the way, that's a bug. Please note it.
What's a bug?
The fact that it's got all this crap here. That's a bug. That should not be there. Right? It should be something, some error, but not that. Make sense? I mean, it could just refuse to evaluate or something, but it can't leave that there. Make sense?
I'm not entirely convinced it's a bug. I would have to
It's
think.
a bug.
it's
a bug.
No.
It's Gigo, right?
Yes, but it's not reasonable to put this there. It should say missing or something like that. Look, it's a weird case because usually if there's an argument missing, things don't evaluate, but this is not evaluation. This is rendering.
Right. If you map legended across that list.
But if I do that, wait a minute, that's just not right. Oh, I have to map legended here, but then it's going to fail because it's not going to know what to do for the second argument, is it?
I mean, you have an extra bracket there. What did that? That is a bug.
Do you need to evaluate it?
Oh, probably.
Which is another thing we should talk about one day. It's getting more sophisticated about that. Like, this is just garbage.
Okay, that's a bug. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just garbage. I mean, it's just not doing the right thing.
Well, legended is only documented to take two arguments.
I know. But again, this case.
I mean, I'm mentioning it for Brett's sake because
Yeah.
It's correct that it only takes two arguments. But the question is, what happens when you have, if I have, it should pink box basically. Look, if I say graphics of disk open close, well, actually that just works. But if I say disk 1, 2, 3, 4, it'll pink box.
Right.
And that's presumably what this should do as well. Or something. I mean, if the rendering of the legend was a pink box, then that would be a fine signal.
Right.
But it just can't
the
be.
tricky
It can't
part
spew
is
out
that
internal garbage.
the tricky part is that you can have anything as the second argument of legended.
Okay, well then, but the thing that is the entrails that spew out should just render as pink or something. Anyway, this is just a bug.
Yep.
But
okay.
I wanted to offer the thought that perhaps the reason legended is less successful is that, style and label are things you often want to apply to individual things, but I feel it's pretty rare where you want to only legend one of the
I agree.
curves.
Well, I mean, so then we have, one of these inside out ones, which is not the best. You know, that's one of, again, that's an inside out story where you're telling it from the inside, I want this on the outside, as
It's
opposed to just saying,
interesting that it's putting placeholders there.
yeah,
I mean, yeah.
well,
The
what should it
Legends
do?
functionality started with data, where it was pre-association and and they're placeholders, and you can type into the placeholders. Right. So
Yeah, I don't think this is quite right, but this is,
Right.
I mean, I think call out
right,
is successful. I think labeled is successful. I think legended. I mean, the other point is that, I mean, how do I get the legends underneath? Do I say placed, automatic, comma? That worked. Very nice.
Right. And I just wanted to offer the thought. I mean, the reason I think that it defaults to that automatic uses placeholders rather than, say, the function names like you would with expressions is, well, the function names works very nicely when you're plotting sine and cosine. But,
Yeah,
if you're
some
plotting
big
some
complicated thing.
Michael Trottian expression, you really don't want to see that.
Yeah. No, I agree. All right. I mean, this whole legended thing and things like that, being able to have legending for a grid would be nice as well.
I mean, there's nothing preventing it.
Well, what happens if I say
Well, I mean,
legended?
I don't know what a
go over
legend
to your
for a
Legended
grid
docs
would be.
window.
Okay.
Go to your help browser and scroll down just a little bit.
Oh, there it is. What do you know? It already works.
Right, but it's legended of grid, and then you say what your legend is.
Yeah, so this is really like a labeled in a particular place.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between this and labeled?
I
mean, if I just said here, this thing here, labeled that, comma, right.
It would look very similar. I mean, the main difference for legended is, I mean, it's special for like the case where you were doing it inside of plot to, highlight specific curves.
Okay, but
and
this is
the
what
fact
this
that
is.
the placement can be inside the content.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I would want to have happen, that I could say legended, X, Y here, and it would do the right thing.
It's an interesting idea.
I mean, I could even imagine callouts doing the right thing here, particularly on the outer boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in any case, let's move on. I mean, I think we've got a family of things to talk about here. Together with, the notion, headed of blah, and I don't think the name is quite right, but the plot grid concept.
Mm-hmm.
Which is going to need headers. Probably, well, maybe not. Maybe that's less important. This concept is important. Okay. Element-wise versus operator forms and map thread. Can you fill in something from that, please? What do you mean?
This was a note we got from some Tabular meeting that I don't think I was at. I know, so maybe
right.
Jose has some context.
Okay, well, so yeah.
So this is a new function we have added element-wise, which is a bit like the inverse of threaded. Threaded prevents listability, element-wise makes functions be listable when they are not. And this is very useful in tabular operations. So the thing, in my opinion, is that this is close to map thread. And so there is some sort of common parts, but one does something, the other one does some other thing. So there may be some deeper connection here between the two. And a separate project is that we have discussed several times to extend map thread to do a few more things. For example, Sander has a nice generalized thread in the function repo.
Okay, by the way, Ahoy is commenting, is there a way to go into a grid and like do annotation in the grid? The answer is no. I mean, we've been rather put off things like that by the fact that so few people use graphics editing, even though we put so much effort into making that work. I mean, I think this is the maybe it would work better for grids. I don't know. I mean, if I like want to highlight that block of things, you know, should I have a way to do that interactively?
Well,
People
and
seem to want that so rarely. I mean, it's just like the graphics thing. It's like, you know, in here, I could, how do I even do it? Well, I can go and, I mean, by the way, we really need, what is the status of getting us a ribbon here? Getting an attached cell.
it's not clear to me what would be in the ribbon.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the first I've ever heard of a ribbon for this.
Well, okay, so how do I edit that curve? Can you even do it anymore?
With the interactivity on, no.
Wow, we didn't even think of that, did we? We didn't even care enough about the curve. Okay, so how do I do that? That's another good reason to
I
have
mean,
the interactivity
this isn't
button.
news to me. It's something I've been aware of, but yeah, as you say, you know, it's not like editing curves is. I mean, frankly, in my view, I'm not even sure what the use case is for editing curves.
Right.
For
I mean,
doing certain kinds of
if
annotations, yes, but actually editing, you know, the existing content, I'm skeptical.
right. I
Yeah,
mean,
well, okay, so
if I'm Stephen, if I'm
yeah,
constructing a a graphics by hand, sure, I might want to interactively edit it. But if I've plotted something, then why would I want
I
to?
know, I know, I know. We goofed back in the 90s, right? When we really put a lot of emphasis on editability of graphics. It just didn't make sense. People just don't want to do it. And the fact that we haven't had a giant, you know, army of pitchforkers complaining about the fact you can't edit it anymore with the interactivity on is a sign that just nobody cares. I mean, I had not realized this point. It hasn't in the 2 years that we've had interactivity here. I haven't even noticed this. Now, you know, the other thing people want to do is to have, you know, an arrow to a curve, but with call out, you have exactly that. You know, nicely organized.
Yeah, well, and as something I was going to say earlier, is, you know, in talking about constructing, you know, like something like Legended, we have toyed around at various times with having constructors for, you know, some of these kind of super function type things. Like I think Lou worked on a manipulate a palette that would do manipulate construction at one point. Not something that we ever shipped, but you know, this feels like the sort of thing that has now migrated into LLM territory. You know, I have a thing and now I want to kind of, you know, poke at it and tweak it, sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the notebook assistant is a better solution. I don't think I've never thought these, you know, WYSIWYG, you know, construct things with a palette things were a good idea. So let me give you an example of something that would be useful to me. Let's say I have an
So,
inset in a
sorry, to be
graph.
clear, the kind of thing I was talking about was doing not interactively affecting and manipulate, but like doing code generation. But for someone who wasn't an expert on the syntax or even knew all the things it could do.
So,
Okay,
now,
yeah, go. I've
so
got a couple of.
is it
Go ahead.
possible to use drawing tools or whatever it is we now call it? I forget. Canvas.
Yeah. Yes, I think that should work.
Right.
I mean, it'll work fine. I can scribble, scribble, scribble on this.
Right. Yeah. So right, because you know, one thing right, I wouldn't edit the curve, but I might, you know, add an arrow to something to say, look right there.
Yeah. Now, how do I turn it from a canvas into a plain graphic?
Is it that normal or graphics of?
Yeah, but why
the
isn't there a button here that just emits the thing as a graphic? There surely should be.
so you want a button that says walk through a trap door so I can never touch this again?
That's what I want. I want this as output.
Even when I said it in that loaded, connotated way.
Yeah. Yes, because what I want here is something. I mean, really, what I want is I want the graphics primitives out of this, so that I can put them in something else. I don't know. I mean, if I take this,
I will
I
just
don't want
point
to
out. I
friggin'.
will just point out again that this was the sort of thing I wanted to see us doing 20 years ago, and I couldn't get people to listen to me.
Which thing?
That the focus on editability being about annotations and annotations that might even be portable.
Yeah, I know. But look, this is wrong. What just happened here? I mean, I just want these to be friggin' graphics that I can deal with as graphics, not as some kind of canvas object. I mean, there's got to be a way to get out of a canvas and back into ordinary graphics. What is it? And I claim doesn't tell you how to do it.
Interesting.
Well,
What happens if you?
Okay, so the problem here is this is not a graphic. It didn't start as a graphic.
Is it a bitmap?
It's the legend or
It's
the label.
legended thing.
Yeah, it started as a grid.
So did this get turned into a bitmap? No, it didn't. It's still a graphic.
It basically, yeah.
Okay, in any case, minor point. I think we should look at how do you get this? How do you get input form? How do you get?
So I think Canvas would do a better job of kind of at least flipping the canvas mode on and off. You can do if the thing that you started with was a graphic, but in this case, that's not what you started with.
I see.
Right. So looks like normal does the canvasify things. So if you put a slash, yeah.
Well, normal a %412.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So that did. What the hell is that?
I mean, it's probably an overlay or something.
Right, because it wants to turn it into a graphic.
Well, actually, %412 was the canvas before you annotated it.
This whole thing is just totally confusing.
Right, you didn't copy the output, right? 412 was before you edited it, so.
This is still some very weird object.
What's the head on it?
It's a graphics. Do input.
No, it's not.
That.
It's an overlay.
Oh, it's an overlay. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
And that's because it didn't start as a
graphics.
graphic. If it started as a graphic, then it would be graphics.
Okay. All right. Let me this business about annotation, we made it work in the 90s. Nobody cared. I don't think we should hyperventilate about it. The thing
I dispute that first statement. We made it work in the 90s. I dispute that.
Well, okay, but let me comment, and I noticed Sander made a comment also on the chat here about this. Being able to edit graphs and move their vertices around would be very useful, and we actually have a WFR that does that, don't we?
Well, and there was a project that Charles was working on at one point to actually work with the front end team on this, but then but it was hard and time consuming, and he got retasked on other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and if it isn't in the global project list, it really should be there. What is the name of the thing? What is its name?
Drag graph vertices.
Is it yours?
Mm,
No, it's
Nick M.
Ian for the win.
that's really nice.
Is
And now
that
if I
still a
evaluate
graph, or is that a graphics now? Oh wow.
look at
Okay.
that.
That's a non-localized dynamic thing.
But how do I make it? Okay, look.
Is the vertex shape
So what's
function
the
like
head of
a?
that thing? First
I
of
think it's
all,
probably graph with a crazy vertex shape function. No.
No.
it's a dynamic module with stuff in it. Okay.
Okay, look. The functionality here is really nice. And being able to take a graph in output and reevaluate and get that graph as input with vertex coordinates is something we'd really like to have. So at the very least, this should be on the global project list. And I think we should think about how to do it. I mean, given that we have, it's clear, I don't know how this works with event handlers and God knows what else. And I would like to see what it does.
It's probably just locators. This is actually,
I mean, we can look at the input form, right? It may not be that horrifying.
yeah, I mean, the implementation
is
of this
pretty-
looks pretty straightforward.
Well, then
Um,
let's just make a real thing of this. I mean, because this is useful. Now, what I would like to do is have a ribbon where I can move that vertex around, and then I can rerun the the graph layout stuff. But even this would be very useful. Just moving a few vertices around, and not have them, So moving those vertices around and then having it be escaped from, and then having just something that comes up. I mean, even if what came up on a graph, on an ordinary graph, was some ribbon thing that allows you to edit, just like we have, if I make a, if I say, something like this, then I can, then I've got these things down here for editing. If I had that for a graph where I could just go into a mode where, I mean, like here, if I say, if I'm doing this and I'm saying, what even is this? This is, okay, so this is now annotation. What am I doing here? Oops. Okay, so this is because of graphics. What does that even mean?
Yeah. Incidentally, Nick did implement this as it's just a locator pane. It's a very straightforward implementation.
So John, since you're looking at the implementation, why is the effect not localized? Isn't dynamic module supposed to localize things to a single instance?
Yeah, dynamic module is um
Look, UX wise, my view is that the graph editor should work like the image editor works. See what I'm saying? You just have buttons down here, and maybe it says only one button for right now. What? Go ahead.
I think there's a bug in resource function actually, which is defeating the localization.
Huh.
I'll follow up on it later.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I will point out that, there is a difference between graph and image in that even though image will have millions of points, the interactivity we offer only allows you to select, a small finite number of subsets of those points. Whereas, if a graph has a million vertices, then yeah, trying to drag them is really not going to work very well.
I understand. So don't do it in that case, right? I mean, the argument that we can't make the simple thing work because the most complicated thing can't work is not a good argument.
Well, okay.
Is
I'm just saying there's always
sometimes not a
going to
good
be someone who
argument.
complains that, we stopped it at, n and they wanted to do it at n+3.
I understand,
mean,
but that's
Itai,
okay.
a graph with 1,000,000 points doesn't renders as a summary box to start with.
Right. Sander is commenting that this particular dragging function doesn't work. If I were to do this graph, what the hell? If I were to do this, let's say this graph here, and I were to say, this, not a very beautiful graph. Well, this has straight edges, whereas the layered graph otherwise would have curves. See, this has stratified everything. So that's an issue. But I mean, that's clearly a solvable issue. Those things are splines. We can move the control points around. This is a thing we should really try to do. This graph editing thing. I mean, it will be super useful. It's clearly, it's clearly a good thing. So can we have a design discussion about it? Take a look at what's there already. Think about it. I mean, as John is pointing out, it's ultimately just a bunch of locators.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think the main issue is going to be, the sort of thing that you're talking about here, where there may be some graph layouts that are not implementable, or not implementable without serious performance problems.
Right, but I think that these things are probably just splines, and insofar as they're that, insofar as you don't try and do everything
I
to,
agree if it's nothing more than a spline, but if there's, for example, if there's some
Well,
kind
like
of
electrical embedding, right, is a global minimization,
I
right?
know, which we
yes,
can't do. So here's
if
what I'm
there's some
saying.
kind of avoidance, a collision avoidance, you're
Okay,
going to have
comment.
problems.
Let me make a comment that if all we provide is take your graph and move vertices around, that's already, I know from being a graph user, so to speak, that's already very useful. The fact that you can't take the moved vertices and then run the optimizer on it is unfortunate, but it's already very useful to just be able to by hand move vertices around. Does that make sense? There are many more luxury features that you could imagine, but that right there is super useful.
Okay, so now when you say a design discussion, do you mean graphics design or some sort of
No, I think we just should have,
language?
look, maybe what we should do is just, here
I mean, and
we should
obviously we'll
just
need to
be,
have Charles in this actual conversation. I'm just
no,
trying
no,
to
I
understand
understand, but what I'm
what sort of
saying is that
conversation you want and where
I
we
think
should
it's
have
going to
it.
be a ribbon around a graph, one of these attached cells on a graph is basically the UX. And just like with an image, if you don't want to edit it, you don't press one of these buttons. And maybe it's a one button ribbon for the time being. See what I'm
Well,
saying?
and it may be the sort of thing where you you press a button and you start making changes and you walk through a trap door
Yeah.
again, where it needs to strip off some options in order to make things work and that sort of thing.
Look, I suspect
And we
if we
just have to
just
telegraph that.
right, if we have a ribbon here, there are things that will be useful for the plot. Even just switch off all the edges, switch off all, there are a bunch of things. Redo the layout. Why not? Put that in the, have the thing where you can pull down the layouts. Why not offer some graph options to be used interactively, where, as you say, the thing that comes out, in the output, you're editing it. And if you hit Shift Enter, then that becomes a graph. A graph is something that you can use pretty interchangeably on input and output. Unlike, well, yes. So I think this is an obvious thing to do. Let's move on with our agenda. We were talking about element-wise and map thread, right?
Yes, there is an example, the third property and relation example of element-wise, I think clarifies the relation. Yes, the one that says for several lists of the same length,
Okay. What if they're not the same length? Does element-wise still work?
Yes. So element-wise
Well,
does
if
more
they have,
things.
right, if they're sort of commensurate, right?
So element-wise does, I mean, yes, but for example, element-wise works with scalars and map-thread does not. And for example, that's something that Sanders' generalized map-thread can handle, and map-thread does not.
Why
So,
doesn't map thread work with that? I mean, it seems like a thing it could easily do.
right. So it can be generalized. So there are a few things that I think we could learn from element-wise in map-thread. But there are probably other cases in which they are not going to do the same thing. So element-wise tries to go as deep as it can, while map-thread requires a level of consistency at the top.
So, I mean, if I go,
Right. So if you, yeah, exactly. Right. But if you did map thread of that, right, it would only,
yeah, go to the first level. Does element-wise have a way of specifying the level?
No. So
No.
element-wise does as much as it can.
right. Element wise is basically, temporarily make F listable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's right. It's like the inverse of threaded.
Yeah.
I guess not exactly the inverse.
Well,
Just
it's not
thread
really
sort
the
of
inverse of
changes,
thread. I
but
mean,
I guess it's the inverse of the non-listable attribute.
wait a minute. Threaded,
Threaded requires at least two. And you need, say, a matrix on the left.
yeah, right. Because it's going to thread into the deeper level.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I use threaded occasionally and it's super useful.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
Well, so what's the question with element-wise?
So Dai says that this comes from a question that we had long ago in a tabular meeting. The only thing I see here is extending map thread to be more powerful in the direction of element-wise.
Yeah. And
Which
making
is-
element-wise take a level spec, which it could do as a second argument.
Perhaps in the, I mean, that
I'm
would
not
be a
sure that
discussion with
makes
Rob.
sense.
I mean,
What's that?
it's a bit like threaded.
Mm.
Threaded also takes
Yeah, I know.
a level spec.
Right.
We would have to discuss that with Rob.
Okay. I think that's a worthwhile discussion, but I don't think it's top priority.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's move on. I mean, I think element-wise, go ahead.
Right. And what about map thread? I mean, it's something we've discussed before and we haven't ever actually done anything about it, but I don't know, are we now more motivated to do it, or are we
I
just sort
think
of
it's low priority, but I think we could consider it.
Mm-hmm.
okay?
All right, let's keep going.
Right. So this is, we have a bunch of key functions, and I think some of them will only take like a single association, and some will take lists of associations, and you know, um, right, like key exists queue versus key free queue. I don't remember. I didn't memorize the table, so somebody constructed a table and said, look, they're all inconsistent,
Well, can
and
we see the table? I mean,
it's
you mean key map, for example, presumably it just takes an association and maps over the keys. I mean, I use it all the time.
right.
Is there a different version of that where you would want to say, have a list of associations and have key map over the association keys, but not over the list? That seems weird.
So take a look at try like key drop.
Oh, that's weird. I see. So it's listability. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that worked. I didn't know that worked.
Right. And so the question is, like I said, I don't think this is a huge thing, and maybe it's not even worth the trouble, but you know, somebody did raise
It's
the
it's
question of,
it's worth looking at, but I don't think it's high priority.
okay,
Okay, tabular interoperability.
right. And you again, you sort of sent that here, and obviously, I think data set is the big one. I'm not sure if there are other things we need to be
Well, I mean, table
considering.
view, grid, all the things we talked about earlier.
Well, I guess I
Here's a
just don't,
naive question.
I mean, I just don't see that. I mean, grid is a typesetting generator, right? It is a device for creating outputs and user interfaces.
Okay, so that doesn't work. I mean, it potentially could work.
But yes, although I don't particularly see any reason why it should. I mean, I suppose you could take the first of the grid but right, that would be no difference than just taking the matrix and feeding it
Yeah,
to
I
that.
agree. I mean, I
Um,
think this goes along with the discussion about headers and all that kind of thing. I mean, well, I guess the other question about tabular interoperability is what kinds of things? I mean, if I say sparse array of, I don't know how I can construct a tabular. I mean, I can construct a tabular with just, you know,
sure.
okay, that's not great, seems to me.
Right. Well, I think the issue is that sort of the normal form of a tabular is not a list of lists. It's a list of associations, and that's not something
I
that
see.
sparse array can consume.
In this case, it would be the matrix. So it
Okay.
could.
Yeah.
It's just that tabular is not array queue. So it doesn't propagate as far as, for example, tabular column is going to be, or it is already a vector queue. So it could reach farther than tabular.
I kind of think these things, just as a courtesy, should just work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something I just randomly happened to try last night, Jose. Maybe you can comment on this. I tried union on a tabular column and it didn't work. Should I expect something like that to work?
Well, I think
That's
eventually,
probably
if it is
something that
vector queue.
should work. Eventual, given Rob's current projects, I think that should. Right. If union works on sparse arrays, then I would expect it to work on tabular columns once Rob's done with his current project. But here's a question. So sparse array of tabular, suppose the normal of the tabular isn't a matrix, then do we just,
Probably it's an error.
then it's an error. Okay.
I mean, I don't know how important this is. I just feel like we've got all these different constructs. It should be possible to interoperate between them.
Okay.
Yes, I understand.
All right, let's talk about to memory. Right now, to memory is being used only for remote tabulars. I'm wondering whether to memory is also relevant for file reading in, for memory, for import. Are there other cases where we have a remote object that is pullable into memory?
Didn't we do something with to memory for audio and video as well?
Oh, if we didn't, we should.
Yeah, those would be
Oh,
the obvious ones to me.
Well, let's make sure we've done that. But the other thing is we could do it for a too big, for example. Does that make sense? No, that doesn't make sense because
No,
that's only
no,
in the
no, no,
front
no.
end.
Because to memory isn't applying to front end objects; it's applying to kernel objects.
Right. Okay, so let's take this, for example. Should work.
Okay, now
Um,
how can we tell that that's in memory? I guess is the question. Well, I guess the to memory thing disappeared, so it did something.
But how do we tell that it's in memory? How do we see that this one isn't in
Well,
memory?
do part 10 of that
Hold on,
percent.
I think it's in the menu. Yeah, the store in note. I mean, the fact that it's not in the notebook is already, I think,
Oh,
is
look,
the
there it
same
is.
as it
Yeah,
not being in memory.
this is not well signaled. Do we have oh yeah, Carlo is here. We should have a way to signal that
Audio
it is
seems
in
to be
memory.
clearer. The documentation has some examples in the to-memory page, and audio indicates it's in a file or it's in notebook.
We have a design, by the way, for video to indicate that properly, and we'll probably get to it to this release.
All right, okay, fine. All right, are there any other cases where to memory is relevant? Are there any other things that are kind of somewhat external? You know, yeah, I mean, another one would be a web page or something, but you know, then it becomes part of import, really.
Yeah, well, I mean that's I think that's really the question. Are there cases where import, is importing, like a symbolic reference instead of the whole thing? And I'm not
I
sure there
don't
are
think
any
so.
other cases.
What about data bins? They're an example,
Are they?
I guess.
I'm
Well, I mean,
I'm
you
not
could say
convinced.
normal. I mean, to memory, look, data bin supports a variety of operations. See here, get of data bin. I mean, it's a minor thing. We could support to memory here, but I'm not sure it's that interesting.
Well, I mean, there is no in-memory equivalent of data bin though.
Yes, well,
Video,
I see what
audio,
you're
and
saying.
tabular all have an in-memory representation.
Yeah, good
That
point.
doesn't change the head.
Yeah. What about a cloud object? I mean, it's really equivalent to cloud import.
Yeah.
Right.
But it might be a good courtesy thing to have.
I don't think so.
Yeah, all right, fine. All right, okay. Well, I can't think of anything else here.
Okay.
All right, quick gander at this. Wait a minute. I see quote slot as a shorthand for hash slot ampersand.
Right.
Well, just give me a report on symbols that are both heads and options. I don't know what to say about that until we've looked at it. I'm not
Well,
keen on it.
so a couple of years ago, I produced a list of, I think it was some 20 some odd symbols. But I mean, the issue is that some of them are kind of deeply ingrained, and it's just doing the work of doing the kind
Yeah,
of design work of fixing it.
yeah.
Right. I have the list. I mean, I can bring that to a meeting. Just it never quite rose to uh, you know, never quite bubbled up to the top.
And you have
Fair
the
enough.
code that generated the list, right? Because there's the
Yes.
danger that more might have been added.
This one, somebody just has to look at it. I don't know what's, I mean, I think that's a good idea, but I don't know. You know, it's things that use associations are candidates for that. New design for partition. I really think we should have an association form for partition. Just like we do, you know, I consider that cellular automaton as a reasonable, successful example of a thing where we have both a, you know, a function form, a positional form, and an association form. Wherever the association form is. Where is it? Oh, here we go. Yeah, here we go. Right. This is the association form. It's successful.
I didn't know
You know,
this had been done.
yeah. So, I mean, this is an alternative to a bunch of arguments, right? And sometimes it's much clearer. This is what we should do for partition as well.
You know, because I didn't know this had been done, that means there are no completions that work for this, almost certainly.
Well, there's some completions there, but they're wrong.
Wi-
Those
wi-
completions are wrong. Not
Yeah,
for the keys.
those are the first argument completions,
Yeah.
not
Okay.
the first argument inside an association completion.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we noticed this. Yeah, it's wrong and should get fixed. But then this is the pattern for how to do it for partition and so on. Make sense?
Yes, but I'll just raise, since some of this may be discussed without me, I'll just raise that, front end team needs to know
Yeah.
if you want completions to work.
Right.
Well,
What's
yeah,
the issue here?
So no, do XYZ instead of XY. Okay, now take that output, do Shift Command L, or copy and paste, and evaluate it.
Oh gosh. That's the only thing it could mean, right? I mean, the plus minus is not associative, right, Jose?
There are some
Pretty sure.
notations in which you indicate two different sources of error, one statistic, one systematic, and they use a double plus minus.
Yeah, I know.
But that's the only
That's
case
a
I can
different
think
thing,
of.
though.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is the only semantically. Otherwise, this just doesn't make sense because the minus of x minus y minus z, is screwy. What's
So,
the question here?
well, I mean, so the question is, do we change the formatting of plus minus so it's semantically correct? Or do we change the parsing so that you can type in that in a 442 and have it preserved?
I don't
Or-
know. I don't know. I think it requires more investigation. I don't know offhand. I
Well,
mean, it.
that's why this is an agenda item and not an action item.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not doing. Oh, whoops! Plus minus this. That's not. We chose not to use plus minus for a round.
Yes.
In my opinion, if users have a meaning for plus minus with several arguments, more than two, then it should be respected when you copy paste, and so they shouldn't have parentheses.
Yeah, I
If you
kind of
if
agree
you
with
want
that.
a double plus minus with parentheses, then you write two plus minus.
So basically, you're saying change the parsing so that it is an n-array operator. So that the
Yes,
infix form is n-array.
exactly. Because if people want this representation of statistic errors separate from systematic errors, then they will not want the parentheses.
I mean, the fact that we broke away around from plus minus kind of makes me think. I mean, I don't think we even support a round of plus minus, do we?
No. Plus minus
But
is the user operator for whatever they want. There are chess notations using plus
yeah.
minus. Right?
So I guess my initial take would be make it an n-array operator for on input.
Okay.
Inserting past the end, doesn't that work?
Nope.
Is it x4 or 4x? Except it does.
Okay. All right. So that works, but if you did like 5.
Then what the hell is it supposed to do?
Okay. Well,
I mean, it would have to have a
talk about
default
it at
argument.
some point. So
Well, it
if
would have a default argument. It would have another fourth. Look, I don't think it's completely stupid to have a default thing here. and have that be able to work. Doesn't seem completely stupid to me.
This is actually, in my mind, a bit connected to element-wise, what element-wise could do with things that aren't rectangular.
That's a good point. That element-wise could have a default argument.
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea.
What about inserting before the beginning?
We don't have a good way to do that.
Can you insert at position 0?
I'm
I
gonna be
don't think
very
you can
amused to see
insert
what
at
happens.
0. I think you can insert at some positions of 0.
Okay.
But you could insert at -4, but I assume not -5.
Well, no, the 2 you could insert at, and it'll do that.
And -4 would put it at the beginning, I believe.
I'm somewhat disappointed that
1
0
puts it
didn't-
at the beginning, unless I'm confused.
Yeah, sure it does.
Yeah.
But -4 is the equivalent of that's the position, that's the beginning slot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel passionate about this, but I like your idea of having a default argument in element-wise, and possibly a map thread. That's something to think about in talking about map thread. All right, we should probably wrap for now. Oh, this is exciting. We need to work on some of that. Okay, I think this is for another time. So we should wrap up now. Thanks, guys.